Picture the volcanic sand of a Pacific island at dawn, the air already thick with heat and smoke, and rolling out of the surf comes a 30-ton steel machine that the defenders simply cannot stop. Japanese tank crews watch their shells strike the sloped front of the American M4 Sherman and ricochet away into the jungle, leaving nothing but a bright scar on the paint. According to reports from nearly every island campaign, the same scene repeated itself again and again, and it defined the armored war in the Pacific. The story of why Japanese tank crews could not penetrate the M4 Sherman is not a story of magic or luck. It is a story of steel, of physics, of doctrine, and of the enormous industrial gap between two nations that had chosen very different paths to war. To understand why the Sherman proved so difficult to defeat, you first have to understand what it actually was. The M4 was never designed to be the heaviest or the most heavily armored tank in the world. American designers built it around a different philosophy entirely. They wanted a medium tank that could be produced in staggering numbers, shipped across two oceans, maintained by young mechanics with only a few weeks of training, and still hold its own against the enemy armor it was most likely to face. The result was a machine weighing roughly 30 tons, protected by frontal hull armor of around 51 millimeters, with a rounded cast turret whose front could reach 76 millimeters or more depending on the variant. That armor was not the thickest in the world, but it was thick enough, and just as importantly, it was well-shaped, sloped to increase its effective resistance against incoming rounds. The main gun on most Pacific Shermans was a 75mm weapon, and this is where a common misunderstanding needs to be cleared up. That gun was chosen not because it was a dedicated tank killer, but because it was an outstanding general-purpose weapon. It fired a genuinely useful high-explosive shell, which mattered enormously in the Pacific, where the real enemies were not massed enemy tanks but bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests, and infantry dug into coral and volcanic rock. Documented engagements show that the Sherman spent far more of its ammunition blasting fortifications apart than dueling other tanks. But when a Japanese armored vehicle did appear, that same 75mm gun was more than capable of destroying it with a single well-placed round. Now compare that to what the Japanese army brought to the fight. The two vehicles American crews encountered most often were the Type 95 light tank and the Type 97 medium tank. The Type 95 was a small machine, weighing only about 7 tons, armed with a 37mm gun and protected by armor that ranged from just 6 to 12 millimeters in most places. Analysis revealed that this vehicle had been designed years earlier for a very different kind of war. One fought across the open plains of Manchuria and China against opponents who often had no tanks at all. Against lightly armed infantry, it could be effective. Against a Sherman, it was almost helpless. The Type 97 medium tank was larger, around 15 tons, but its original 57mm gun was a low-velocity weapon built for infantry support, throwing its shell at a speed far too slow to punch through American armor at any meaningful range. If you are finding this breakdown of Pacific armored warfare useful, take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because it genuinely helps more than you know, and it lets us keep bringing you these deep dives into the machines and the men who fought these battles. Now let us get into the physics of why those Japanese shells simply bounced off. Armor penetration is not a matter of opinion or courage. It is a matter of mathematics, of the energy a projectile carries when it strikes a plate, and the angle at which it makes contact. When a shell hits armor, it must overcome the resistance of the steel, and whether it succeeds depends on the mass of the projectile, the velocity at which it is traveling, the hardness and thickness of the plate, and the angle of impact. A slow, light shell striking thick, sloped, well-made armor will fail. This is exactly the situation Japanese tank crews found themselves in over and over again. Their 37mm guns and their low-velocity 57mm guns simply did not generate enough energy to defeat the Sherman's frontal protection. Japanese engineers understood this problem, and they tried to solve it. Later in the war, they upgraded the Type 97 with a new turret carrying a 47mm high-velocity gun, producing the version often called the improved medium tank. This weapon was a genuine step forward. Documented tests and combat reports indicate that under ideal conditions, At close range and against a flat plate struck squarely, the 47mm gun could penetrate somewhere in the neighborhood of 50mm of armor. On paper, that sounds like it should have been enough to threaten a Sherman. In reality, the ideal conditions almost never existed. Here is why. Combat ranges in the Pacific were rarely the neat, flat firing range scenarios that penetration tables assume. Terrain, vegetation, and the chaos of battle meant that shots came in at angles. And the Sherman's sloped and rounded armor meant that even a shell that struck it was frequently deflected rather than absorbed. A round that might penetrate 50mm against a vertical plate would lose much of its effectiveness against armor that was angled away from it, because the effective thickness the shell had to travel through increased dramatically. Crews reported that hits which should have been fatal instead skated off the curved turret or the glacis plate, leaving the American tank fully operational. The Japanese gunners were not incompetent. They were fighting physics, and physics does not negotiate. There was another dimension to this problem, one that had nothing to do with the guns themselves and everything to do with the steel behind them. Japanese industry, stretched thin across an enormous war effort and starved of raw materials, struggled to produce armor plate and projectiles of consistent quality. Analysis of recovered equipment revealed that even when a Japanese shell struck a target, it might shatter on impact rather than penetrate, because the metallurgy of the projectile was not up to the task. Meanwhile, American manufacturing turned out armor plate and ammunition to exacting and consistent standards, in quantities that dwarfed anything Japan could manage. This industrial gap did not show up in the specification sheets, but it showed up decisively on the battlefield. To really appreciate what the Japanese tank crews were up against, consider the day-to-day reality inside a Sherman. These were not crude machines. The M4 carried a crew of 5, each with a defined role, working inside a vehicle that offered a level of sophistication its opponents could scarcely match. Many Shermans were fitted with a gyroscopic stabilizer for the main gun, a device that helped keep the weapon roughly on target even while the tank was moving over rough ground. Crews who trained with it could fire accurately on the move or snap off a first shot the moment they halted, a capability that gave them a decisive edge in the opening seconds of an engagement, when the first accurate shot very often decided the outcome. Every Sherman also carried a radio, and this single fact reshaped the entire nature of armored combat. American tank platoons could coordinate their movements, concentrate their fire, warn one another of threats, and call for support in real time. A platoon of Shermans did not fight as 5 separate machines. It fought as a single coordinated organism, each tank covering the others, each crew aware of the whole picture. Documented engagements show American armor flanking, supporting, and overwhelming isolated Japanese vehicles precisely because the Americans could talk to one another while their opponents often could not. The contrast in doctrine ran even deeper than radios. The Japanese army had never developed the concept of the tank as the centerpiece of a combined arms team, in the way the major armored powers had. Historians note that Japanese armor was frequently parceled out in small groups to support infantry or thrown into action piecemeal, rather than massed and used as a decisive striking force. There was no strong tradition of tank versus tank warfare in Japanese planning, because for much of the 1930s, their armored forces had faced enemies who could not fight back on equal terms. When they finally collided with American armor in the Pacific, they were fighting a kind of war their doctrine had never fully prepared them for. Consider what happened across the island campaigns, described in general terms without inventing details that were never recorded. On the atoll fighting of the Central Pacific, American Shermans came ashore under murderous fire and pushed inland against fortified positions, and where Japanese armor tried to intervene, it was almost always outmatched. Crews reported engagements in which a single Sherman round destroyed a Japanese light tank outright, while return fire from those same enemy tanks left only superficial marks on the American armor. The pattern was so consistent that it shaped how commanders on both sides thought about the fighting. American crews grew confident in their protection. Japanese commanders learned at terrible cost that sending their tanks into a straight fight with Shermans was close to suicidal. The largest Japanese armored counterattack of the Pacific War unfolded during the Battle for the Mariana Islands, in the campaign known as Operation Forager in the middle of 1944. According to reports, the Japanese assembled the strongest concentration of tanks they would field against American forces in the theater, and launched them in a night attack, hoping that surprise and mass might overcome the American advantage. What followed became a case study in the futility of that hope. American forces, using their tanks, their anti-tank guns, their bazookas, and even the guns of ships offshore, shattered the attack. Documented engagements show that the great majority of the attacking Japanese tanks were destroyed in a matter of hours, many of them knocked out before they could do any meaningful damage at all. It was, in effect, the death of Japanese armor as an offensive force in the Pacific. Why did it fail so completely? Because everything came together against the attackers. Their tanks were thinly armored and could be destroyed by almost any American anti-armor weapon. Their guns could not reliably defeat the Sherman's protection. Their coordination broke down in the darkness and confusion. And their attack ran headlong into a defense that was flexible, well-armed, and backed by overwhelming firepower. Analysis revealed that the Japanese crews often pressed home their attacks with tremendous courage, but courage could not close the technological and doctrinal gap. Their machines were simply not built to survive contact with the American armor and anti-tank defenses arrayed against them. It is worth pausing here to be fair to those Japanese crews because the human story matters as much as the technical one. These were men who climbed into vehicles they surely knew were outmatched and who fought anyway. Crews reported that Japanese tankers frequently attacked with a determination that bordered on the reckless, driving straight at positions that offered them almost no chance of survival. There is a grim tragedy in that. The failure was not one of individual bravery or skill. It was a failure that had been decided years earlier, in the design bureaus, in the factories, and the strategic planning rooms, long before these men ever reached the battlefield. They inherited machines built for a war that no longer existed, and they paid the price for decisions made far above their heads. The Sherman crews, for their part, faced their own kind of hell, and it would be wrong to imagine that their superior tanks made the fighting easy. The Pacific was a nightmare of climate and terrain for armored warfare. Analysis of the campaigns describes tanks bogging down in swamps, overheating in tropical humidity, throwing their tracks on jagged coral, and struggling up volcanic slopes where a single wrong move could leave a machine stranded and vulnerable. The real threat to a Sherman in the Pacific was rarely another tank. It was the terrain, the anti-tank guns hidden in the jungle, the mines, and above all the Japanese infantry, who developed desperate and dangerous close assault tactics to attack the tanks that their own armor could not stop. That last point deserves attention because it reveals something important. When your tanks cannot defeat the enemy's tanks, the burden of anti-tank defense falls on your infantry, and the Japanese army adapted in exactly that way. Crews reported that Japanese soldiers would attempt to attack Shermans at extremely close range, trying to place explosive charges against the tracks or the more vulnerable rear and top surfaces, or aiming for the vision devices and the engine grills. These tactics were incredibly dangerous for the men who attempted them, and they represented a kind of last resort. The very existence of these desperate methods is itself proof of the point. If Japanese tank guns could have simply destroyed Shermans at range, none of these suicidal close assault tactics would ever have been necessary. American crews learned to counter these threats by never operating alone. Documented tactics show Shermans working in close cooperation with their own infantry, who screened the tanks and kept enemy soldiers from getting close enough to attack them. This combined arms teamwork, the tank and the foot soldier protecting one another, was exactly the kind of coordinated warfare that Japanese doctrine had never fully embraced. It turned the Sherman from a merely well-protected machine into the heart of an integrated fighting force that was extraordinarily difficult to defeat. The tank provided firepower and protection, the infantry provided eyes and close security, and together they advanced across islands that the enemy had turned into fortresses. Step back and look at the whole picture, and the reason for Japanese failure becomes clear. It was never a single factor. It was the accumulation of many. The Sherman's armor was thicker and better shaped than anything Japanese guns were designed to defeat. Its main gun could destroy any Japanese tank it encountered with ease. Its reliability meant it kept fighting where lesser machines would have broken down. Its radio and its stabilizer gave its crews a coordination and accuracy their opponents could not match. And behind all of it stood an industrial machine that could produce these tanks by the tens of thousands and ship them anywhere on Earth. The Japanese, by contrast, brought lighter tanks, weaker guns, thinner and lower quality armor, and a doctrine that had never fully grasped how modern armored warfare was meant to be fought. There is a deeper lesson buried in all of this, one that goes beyond the specifications of any single machine. The war between the Sherman and the Japanese tanks was, in miniature, a war between two entire systems of thinking about conflict. One side treated the tank as a mass-produced, reliable, coordinated tool, one component in a vast integrated war machine backed by immense industrial power. The other side had frozen its armored development years too early, had never invested in the doctrine or the industry required to keep pace, and found itself sending brave men into battle in vehicles that were obsolete before they ever fired a shot. When those two systems met on the beaches and in the jungles of the Pacific, the outcome was never really in doubt. This is why the story is so often told as one of American steel proving invincible. In the specific matchups of the Pacific, against the specific enemy tanks it faced, the Sherman really did prove nearly impossible for Japanese crews to destroy in a fair fight. That was not because the Sherman was some invulnerable superweapon. In the fighting in Europe against heavier and better armed German tanks, the very same Sherman would find itself outgunned and would earn a far more complicated and painful reputation. Context is everything. But in the Pacific, matched against the Type 95 and the Type 97 and the improved medium tank, the M4 held an advantage so wide that the outcome of nearly every armored encounter was decided before it began. The men who crewed those Shermans understood their advantage, but rarely took it for granted, because the Pacific found other ways to kill them. And the men who crewed the Japanese tanks understood their disadvantage all too well, and climbed into their machines anyway. When we look back at the twisted, burned-out hulks that littered those islands after the fighting, we are looking at the physical evidence of a technological and industrial gulf that no amount of individual courage could bridge. The Sherman did not win those duels because its crews were braver. It won because the machine, the doctrine, and the industry behind it were all aligned toward the same purpose, while its opponents were fighting with the tools of an earlier age. That is the real story behind the headline. The M4 Sherman proved so hard for Japanese tank crews to penetrate, not because of any single miraculous quality, but because of 100 sensible decisions layered on top of one another. Decisions about armor shape and gun choice and reliability and radios and mass production, all of them made years before the first shell was ever fired in anger. Physics did the rest. A slow, light shell, striking thick, well-angled, high-quality steel, will not penetrate. And no amount of will can change that equation. The Japanese crews learned that truth the hardest way imaginable, and the record of the Pacific War is written in the scars those failed shells left on American armor that simply refused to be stopped. Let us go deeper into the machine itself, because the Sherman's advantages become even clearer when you take it apart piece by piece. Consider the engine, the beating heart of any tank. The M4 came in several variants powered by different engines, and this itself tells you something about American industrial flexibility. Some Shermans used a radial aircraft-derived engine, others a pair of truck diesels linked together, and still others a massive multi-bank arrangement of automobile engines bolted into a single unit. That variety could have been a logistical nightmare, but American organization turned it into a strength, matching engines to available production capacity and keeping the tanks flowing to the front. Documented reports from the field describe these power plants pushing the 30-ton vehicle to speeds of roughly 24 to 30 miles per hour on good ground, giving the Sherman a mobility that its crews could rely on when they needed to reposition quickly under fire. Reliability is a word that gets used a great deal when people discuss the Sherman, and it deserves to be explained rather than simply repeated. A tank that breaks down is worthless no matter how thick its armor or how powerful its gun. Analysis of the Pacific campaigns shows that the ability to keep tanks running, day after day, in appalling heat and humidity and across terrain that punished machinery mercilessly, was often the difference between a unit that could fight and one that could not. The Sherman was built to be maintained by ordinary soldiers with ordinary tools. Its components were designed for replacement rather than delicate repair. When something failed, a crew could often fix it in the field and be back in action while a more temperamental machine would have been left behind. This unglamorous quality, the simple fact of continuing to work, may have destroyed more Japanese tanks in the aggregate than any single feature of the gun or the armor, because it meant American armor was present in strength, at the decisive moment again and again. Now return to the guns, because the numbers reward a closer look. The 75mm gun carried by most Pacific Shermans fired its armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity high enough to defeat any Japanese tank at ordinary combat ranges with room to spare. But that gun's true value in this theater lay in the versatility of its ammunition. It could fire a high-explosive round that was devastating against bunkers and infantry, an armor-piercing round for the rare tank duel, and smoke rounds to screen movement. Documented engagements show crews switching between these ammunition types as the situation demanded, blasting a pillbox apart one moment and being fully ready to destroy an enemy tank the next. The Japanese guns, by contrast, lacked this flexibility. Their smaller weapons were poorly suited to the fortification-busting role, and their armor-piercing capability was inadequate against the Sherman, leaving them weak in both of the roles that mattered most. There is a particular variant of the Sherman that deserves special mention when discussing the Pacific, and that is the flamethrowing version. On islands defended by an enemy who fought from caves, tunnels, and deeply buried bunkers, the ability to project fire into a fortified position was worth more than almost any conventional weapon. Analysis of the later island battles describes flame-equipped Shermans advancing on positions that had resisted every other form of attack and reducing them methodically. For the defenders, the appearance of such a machine was a terrifying prospect, and there was very little their own tanks or anti-tank guns could do to stop it, since those weapons could not penetrate the Sherman that carried the flame gun. Once again, the theme repeats. The American tank could be adapted to solve the specific problems of the Pacific War, while the Japanese armor could not even reliably harm the machine that was solving them. Think about the experience of a Japanese gunner for a moment, because the psychology of this fight is as revealing as the engineering. Imagine sighting your gun on the flank of an American tank, firing at a range where your training tells you a hit should be effective, watching your shell strike true, and then seeing the enemy machine simply continue forward as though nothing had happened. Crews reported exactly this kind of demoralizing experience. There are few things more corrosive to the morale of a fighting force than the discovery that your weapons do not work against the enemy in front of you. This psychological dimension compounded the technical one. A gunner who has seen his rounds bounce is a gunner who begins to doubt, and doubt in the middle of an armored engagement can be fatal. The material inferiority of the Japanese tanks thus produced a second, invisible wound, one that struck at the confidence of the men who crewed them. Contrast that with the confidence of the American crews. Documented accounts describe Sherman crews growing so assured of their protection against Japanese tank guns that they would maneuver aggressively, pressing engagements they might have avoided against a more dangerous opponent. This confidence was not arrogance. It was a rational response to repeated experience. When you have watched enemy shells fail to penetrate your armor time after time, you learn to trust that armor, and that trust frees you to fight more boldly and more effectively. The Sherman crews could focus their attention on the genuine threats, the hidden anti-tank guns and the close assault infantry, precisely because they did not have to fear the enemy tanks in the same way. Confidence grounded in real protection became yet another force multiplier stacked on top of all the others. It is worth widening the lens to explain how the two nations arrived at such different machines, because the tanks did not appear out of nowhere. Japan's armored development had been shaped by the wars it expected to fight and the resources it could command. Its early tank designs were tailored for mobility and for supporting infantry across the vast distances of the Asian mainland, against opponents who rarely possessed armor of their own. Lightweight was a virtue in that context, because it meant tanks could cross fragile bridges and move quickly over poor roads. But this same emphasis left Japanese armor thin-skinned and undergunned when the character of the war changed. Meanwhile, chronic shortages of steel and other strategic materials meant that even when Japanese designers understood the need for heavier, better-armed tanks, the industrial base to produce them in quantity simply was not there. Analysis of wartime production figures reveals an enormous disparity in output that no amount of clever design could have overcome. American tank development followed a very different logic. The United States entered its great armored expansion with an industrial capacity unmatched anywhere on Earth. The same factories that had built the world's automobiles now turned to building tanks. This allowed designers to make choices the Japanese could never contemplate. They could standardize on a medium tank and then produce it in overwhelming numbers, refine it continuously, and ship it across the globe. They could afford to build in reliability and crew comfort, in radios and stabilizers, and the countless small refinements that separated a good tank from a merely adequate one. The Sherman was, in a very real sense, the product of an entire industrial civilization organized for war, and it carried that advantage into every engagement it fought. The consequences of this disparity played out across the entire Pacific, from the earliest campaigns in the tropical jungles to the final brutal battles on the approaches to Japan itself. In the fighting for the Solomon Islands, in the long, grinding struggle across New Guinea, in the amphibious assaults on the fortified atolls of the Central Pacific, and in the great campaign to liberate the Philippines, the same essential story repeated with local variations. Wherever American Shermans encountered Japanese armor in significant numbers, the Japanese tanks were destroyed, usually quickly and often without inflicting meaningful damage in return. Historians note that after the failure of the Great Armored Counterattack in the Marianas, the Japanese increasingly gave up on using their tanks as a mobile striking force altogether. Instead, they dug them into the ground and used them as fixed firing points, static strong points in their defensive lines. It was an admission, written in earth and steel, that their armor could no longer fight the American tanks in the open and hope to survive. That decision to bury the tanks and use them as pillboxes is one of the most telling details in the entire story. A tank's whole reason for existing is mobility, the ability to bring firepower and protection to a decisive point, and then move on. To dig a tank into the ground is to throw away the very quality that makes it a tank. The Japanese did this not out of ignorance, but out of grim necessity, because a dug-in tank at least presented a smaller target and could not be so easily flanked and destroyed. Documented engagements from the later island battles describe American forces methodically reducing these buried strongpoints, often with the flame-throwing Shermans or with concentrated high-explosive fire. The Japanese armor, unable to win as tanks, spent its final month serving as immobile fortifications, and even in that role it was systematically overcome. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to reduce it to a simple tale of superior technology crushing inferior technology, but the truth is richer and more human than that. The Japanese crews were not fools, and their engineers were not incompetent. They were working within constraints of doctrine, of resources, of strategic circumstance that had been set long before the shooting started. And within those constraints, they often performed with real skill and extraordinary courage. The failure was systemic, not individual. It lay in a strategic and industrial mismatch that placed brave men and obsolete machines against an enemy that had made almost every major decision correctly. When we say the Sherman proved nearly impossible for Japanese crews to penetrate, we are describing the outcome of that mismatch, not passing judgment on the men who found themselves on the losing side of it. And there is one more dimension worth exploring, which is what these battles teach us about warfare more broadly. The armored fighting in the Pacific is a vivid demonstration that victory in modern war is rarely decided by a single heroic weapon or a single brilliant tactic. It is decided by systems, by the accumulated effect of 1,000 decisions about production, doctrine, logistics, training, and design, all working together or all failing together. The Sherman was not invincible because of any one thing. It was formidable because everything around it, the factories that built it, the ships that carried it, the doctrine that employed it, the infantry that protected it, and the radios that coordinated it, all pulled in the same direction. The Japanese tanks failed for the mirror image reason, because the systems around them were fractured, under-resourced, and out of step with the war they were actually fighting. That is the lesson that outlasts the specific machines, and it is why students of military history return to these specific battles again and again. When the guns finally fell silent across those islands, the wreckage told the whole story without a word. American tanks, scarred and battered but often repairable, sat alongside the burned-out hulks of Japanese armor that had been comprehensively destroyed. The scars on the Sherman's armor, the bright gouges where enemy shells had struck and failed, were a kind of testimony, physical proof of every round that had been fired in hope and had accomplished nothing. Those marks were the record of a one-sided contest, decided not on the battlefield, but in the years of planning and production that preceded it. The Japanese crews had brought everything they had, courage and skill and determination, and it had not been enough because the gap they were trying to bridge had never been a gap of will. It was a gap of steel, of physics, and of industrial might, and no amount of courage has ever closed a gap like that. It is also worth reflecting on how this armored mismatch shaped the wider rhythm of the Pacific campaigns, because tanks never fight in isolation. When American commanders knew that their Shermans could dominate any enemy armor they met, it freed them to plan their assaults around the tank as a dependable spearhead. Documented planning from the island campaigns shows armor being integrated into the very first waves of amphibious assaults, brought ashore under fire to punch through beach defenses and shield the infantry from the fortified positions that would otherwise have cut them down. That confidence in the machine allowed for bolder, faster operations. A commander who has to worry that his tanks might be destroyed by enemy armor plans cautiously. A commander who knows his tanks will win every armored encounter can plan aggressively, and that difference rippled outward into the entire tempo of the war in the Pacific, accelerating advances that might otherwise have bogged down. The reverse was true for the Japanese defenders, whose inability to contest the American armor forced them into an increasingly defensive and attritional posture. Analysis of their tactics over the course of the war reveals a steady shift away from mobile counterattacks and toward deep, static defenses built into the terrain itself, into caves and tunnels and reinforced bunkers. This was a rational adaptation to their weakness, but it was also a confession of it. An army that cannot maneuver its armor against the enemy is an army that has surrendered the initiative. And the Japanese forces in the later Pacific battles fought almost entirely on the defensive, trading ground and lives for time. The dominance of the Sherman was one of the quiet forces driving that transformation, one of the reasons the defenders were pushed into a style of warfare that could delay the American advance, but could never reverse it. One final comparison brings the whole matter into focus, and it concerns the crews themselves and the training that stood behind them. A tank is only ever as good as the people inside it, and here too the American advantage was profound. Documented accounts describe Sherman crews who had trained extensively together, who understood their vehicle intimately, and who could exploit every one of its capabilities under the extreme stress of combat. They knew how to use the stabilizer, how to coordinate over the radio, how to work with the infantry beside them, and how to keep their machine running when it faltered. This depth of training turned an already superior machine into something greater than the sum of its parts. The Japanese crews, fighting in inferior vehicles and often with less opportunity to develop the same integrated skills, faced a compounding disadvantage. Because even where their courage matched or exceeded that of their opponents, the system they operated within could not give them the tools to convert that courage into victory. When a superbly trained crew in a superior machine meets a brave crew in an outmatched one, the outcome is written before the first shot, and across the Pacific that outcome was written thousands of times over. If this deep dive gave you a new way of seeing the armored war in the Pacific, consider subscribing and leaving a comment with the machine or the battle you would like us to break down next, because there is far more to this story than any single video can hold, and the more you engage, the more of these we can bring you. The steel, the physics, and the men who fought inside these machines all have more secrets left to tell, and we are only just getting started.